The shadow in Game of Thrones characters. The mirror of Westeros. Picture this. You're watching Game of Thrones, and despite everything terrible Tyrion Lannister has done, you find yourself rooting for him. Or maybe you're disgusted by Cersei's actions, yet you can't look away. Why do these morally complex characters captivate us so deeply? The answer lies not in the fantasy realm of Westeros, but in the hidden chambers of our own psyche. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, would tell us that these characters aren't just entertainment, they're mirrors reflecting what he called our shadow. Jung believed that every person carries within them a shadow self, containing all the aspects of our personality that we've rejected, denied, or hidden away. The parts of ourselves we don't want to admit exist. When we watch Game of Thrones, we are not just observing fictional characters navigate power, betrayal, and survival. We are witnessing externalized versions of our own internal struggles. The very reason these characters feel so real, so compelling, is because they embody the shadow aspects we all carry but rarely acknowledge. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever felt a secret satisfaction when someone who wronged you faced consequences? Have you ever made a decision purely out of self-interest, even when you knew it might hurt others? Have you ever craved power or recognition more than you'd care to admit? These aren't shameful secrets, they're human. And they're exactly what Jung would call shadow material. Today, we are going to explore how three of the most psychologically complex characters from Game of Thrones can teach us about our own shadows. More importantly, we'll discover how Jung's revolutionary approach to shadow work can transform these hidden aspects from sources of shame into catalysts for genuine personal growth and self-acceptance. Understanding Jung's shadow concept. Before we dive into the dragons and political intrigue, let's understand what Jung meant by the shadow. According to Jung, the shadow represents the unconscious aspect of our personality that our conscious ego doesn't identify with. It's not inherently evil. That's a common misconception. The shadow simply contains everything we've been taught is unacceptable about ourselves. Jung explained it this way. Imagine you're holding a bright light behind an object. The object casts a shadow, not because the object itself is dark, but because it's blocking the light. Similarly, our psychological shadow forms when we suppress certain traits to fit societal expectations, family dynamics, or our own idealized self-image. Here's the crucial insight Jung discovered. What we resist persists. The more we deny these shadow aspects, the more power they have over us. They influence our decisions, relationships, and reactions in ways we don't even realize. Jung called this phenomenon projection. We literally project our disowned shadow qualities onto others, which is why we have such strong emotional reactions to certain people or characters. This is exactly what happens when we watch Game of Thrones. The characters we love to hate, or hate to love, are often carrying projections of our own shadow material. They're doing, saying, or embodying things that resonate with suppressed parts of ourselves. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung discovered that shadow integration, consciously acknowledging and accepting these hidden aspects, doesn't make us worse people. It makes us more complete, more authentic, and paradoxically, more capable of genuine goodness. When we stop using energy to suppress our shadow, we free that energy for creativity, relationships, and purposeful action. So when we analyze these Game of Thrones characters through a Jungian lens, we are not just engaging in literary criticism. We are practicing a form of shadow work that can profoundly impact our self-awareness and personal development. Tyrion Lannister, the intellectual shadow. Let's start with Tyrion Lannister, perhaps the most beloved character in the series despite his many moral compromises. What makes Tyrion so compelling isn't just his wit or intelligence, it's how he embodies what we might call the intellectual shadow. Tyrion represents the part of us that uses intellect as both a weapon and a shield. Jung would recognize in Tyrion the archetype of the wounded healer, someone whose personal pain becomes a source of wisdom, but also manipulation. Tyrion's physical disability in a world that values strength creates a shadow response. He develops his mind as compensation, but also uses it to wound others before they can wound him. How many of us recognize this pattern in ourselves? When we feel vulnerable or inadequate, Do we sometimes retreat into intellectual superiority? Do we use our knowledge or wit to put others down, to feel superior, to avoid genuine emotional intimacy? Tyrion's constant jokes and clever remarks often serve as armor, protecting him from deeper emotional wounds. Jung believed that our greatest strengths often develop directly from our deepest wounds, but they can also become our shadow traps. Tyrion's intelligence, his greatest asset, is also his shadow burden. He uses it to manipulate, to avoid accountability, and to maintain emotional distance. When he orchestrates the deaths of his enemies or manipulates political situations, he justifies it through rational analysis, avoiding the emotional weight of his actions. But here's what's fascinating about Tyrion's character arc. His journey toward wholeness requires him to acknowledge not just his intellectual gifts, but his emotional needs and moral compromises. The moments when Tyrion is most human, when he shows genuine vulnerability or makes decisions based on love rather than strategy, are the moments when he integrates his shadow. Ask yourself, in what ways do you use your strengths to avoid facing your emotional vulnerabilities? How might your greatest gifts also serve as hiding places for aspects of yourself you'd rather not examine? Jung would suggest that true wisdom comes not from perfecting our strengths, but from understanding how they can both serve and sabotage us. Tyrion teaches us that intellectual honesty must extend beyond external analysis to internal examination. The same sharp mind that can solve complex political problems must be turned inward to examine our own motivations, fears, and hidden agendas. Jaime Lannister, the redemption shadow. Jaime Lannister presents us with perhaps the most complex shadow work in the entire series. He is a character who commits one of the most morally reprehensible acts we can imagine, pushing a child from a window, yet somehow evolves into someone we actually empathize with and even admire. How is this possible? Because Jaime embodies what Jung called the process of individuation through shadow integration. Initially, Jaime appears to be pure shadow, arrogant, cruel, incestuous, seemingly without conscience. But as his story unfolds, we discover that his shadow behaviors were largely defensive reactions to impossible moral situations. The Kingslayer reputation that defined him was actually born from a moment of moral courage, killing the Mad King to save hundreds of thousands of innocent lives, then accepting public shame rather than explaining his actions. Jung would recognize in Jaime's story the profound truth about shadow work. Our most destructive behaviors are often corrupted expressions of our deepest values. Jaime's love for Cersei, twisted as it becomes, starts from genuine devotion. His arrogance masks deep insecurity about living up to his father's expectations and his own moral ideals. The turning point in Jaime's arc comes when he begins to separate his true self from his shadow persona. Losing his sword hand, the source of his identity as a knight, forces him to confront who he is beyond his roles and reputations. This is exactly what Jung described as the death that must occur before psychological rebirth. Think about your own life. What persona or identity have you built that might be hiding your authentic self? What would happen if the thing you most identified with, your career, your role in relationships, your reputation, was suddenly stripped away? Would you know who you are underneath? Jaime's relationship with Brienne becomes crucial because she sees past his shadow persona to his potential for honor and goodness. Jung emphasized that shadow integration often requires what he called a witnessing other, someone who can hold space for both our darkness and our light without judgment. The redemption shadow that Jaime represents teaches us that no one is beyond transformation, but authentic change requires facing our worst actions and motivations honestly. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming integrated. Jaime never becomes a conventional hero, but he becomes a whole person who can act from authentic choice rather than unconscious compulsion. What parts of your past are you still defending rather than learning from? How might your greatest mistakes actually contain seeds of your greatest wisdom? Cersei Lannister, the power shadow. Cersei Lannister represents perhaps the most challenging shadow aspect to examine, the hunger for power and control. While audiences generally despise Cersei, Jung would urge us to look deeper. What drives someone to such extremes of manipulation, cruelty, and destructive behavior? And more importantly, What does our reaction to her reveal about our own relationship with power? Cersei embodies what happens when the natural human need for agency and influence becomes corrupted by fear, trauma, and unconscious shadow material. Jung observed that our most destructive behaviors often emerge from our most fundamental needs: the need for safety, recognition, love, and control over our circumstances. Cersei's power shadow develops from a combination of gender-based powerlessness in her society and deep emotional wounds from childhood. Her famous quote, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die," reveals the black and white thinking that Jung identified as characteristic of shadow possession. When we are consumed by shadow energy, we lose the ability to see nuance, to empathize, or to find creative solutions. But here's what makes Cersei such a valuable mirror for shadow work. She shows us how the desire for power can mask deeper emotional needs. Her need to control others stems from feeling fundamentally out of control herself. Her manipulation of situations comes from a deep fear of vulnerability. Her cruelty often emerges when she feels threatened or powerless. Most of us would never behave like Cersei, but how many of us have never used manipulation to get what we want? How many have never felt secret satisfaction when someone we dislike faces difficulties? How many have never prioritized our own needs at the expense of others' well-being? These aren't equivalent to Cersei's extremes, but they're the same shadow material in smaller doses. Jung believed that we must own our capacity for destruction before we can access our capacity for genuine creation. Cersei's character forces us to examine uncomfortable questions. In what ways do you try to control others when you feel powerless? How do you respond when someone threatens your ego or security? What would you be capable of if you felt truly cornered? The power shadow that Cersei represents teaches us that authentic power comes from self-mastery, not control over others. When we are secure in ourselves, we don't need to diminish others to feel strong. When we've integrated our shadow need for power, we can use influence to serve rather than dominate. Integrating your own shadow. So how do we actually work with our shadow material in real life? Jung provided several practical approaches that we can apply using insights from these Game of Thrones characters. First, practice what Jung called active imagination with your emotional reactions. When you have a strong response to someone, whether attraction or repulsion, ask yourself what qualities in that person might reflect disowned aspects of yourself. If Tyrion's manipulation bothers you, explore your own relationship with using intellect to avoid emotional intimacy. If Cersei's power hunger disgusts you, examine your own needs for control and recognition. Second, develop what Jung termed conscious confrontation with your shadow projections. Instead of immediately judging others or defending yourself, pause and ask, what might this person or situation be reflecting back to me about myself? This doesn't mean taking responsibility for others' behavior, but rather using their behavior as information about your inner landscape. Third, practice shadow dialogue through journaling or meditation. Jung often had his patients literally have conversations with different aspects of their personality. You might write a dialogue between your acceptable self and the part of you that identifies with Tyrion's cynicism, Jaime's capacity for moral compromise, or even Cersei's hunger for power. Fourth, find safe spaces and relationships where you can explore these shadow aspects without judgment. Just as Jaime needed Brienne to witness his potential for honor, we all need people who can hold space for our complexity, our light and our darkness. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate shadow aspects but to integrate them consciously. A person who has never felt anger might seem virtuous, but they likely lack the healthy boundaries that appropriate anger provides. Someone who has never felt selfish impulses might appear selfless, but they may also struggle with healthy self-advocacy. The characters of Game of Thrones teach us that authentic wholeness includes shadow integration. Tyrion's intelligence becomes wisdom when tempered with emotional honesty. Jaime's capacity for violence becomes protective strength when guided by genuine values. Even Cersei's drive for power, if integrated rather than possessed by shadow, could become effective leadership and self-advocacy. As we close this exploration of shadow work through the lens of Westeros, I want you to sit with this profound truth. The very characters that disturb, fascinate, or compel you in Game of Thrones are offering you a roadmap to your own psychological wholeness. Jung spent his life studying the human psyche, and his central message was revolutionary. We don't become good people by denying or suppressing our darker impulses. We become whole people by consciously integrating all aspects of ourselves: light and shadow, strength and weakness, noble intentions and selfish desires. The beauty of using fictional characters for shadow work is that they provide a safe distance from which to examine difficult psychological material. Tyrion, Jaime, and Cersei aren't just characters in a fantasy epic. They're archetypal representations of shadow aspects we all carry. Through understanding their journeys, we can better understand our own. So here's my challenge for you. Over the next week, pay attention to your strong emotional reactions, to people, to news, to situations that trigger you. Instead of immediately judging or defending, ask yourself Jung's fundamental question: what part of myself am I seeing reflected here? Start a shadow work journal. Write about the aspects of yourself you've been trying to hide or improve. Not to judge them, but to understand them. What needs are these shadow aspects trying to meet? What would it look like to integrate rather than suppress them? And remember, this work isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming real. As Jung said, I'd rather be whole than good. The world doesn't need more people pretending to be perfect. It needs more people willing to be authentic, to own their complexity, and to use their integrated shadow material in service of genuine connection and creative contribution. The shadow work we've explored today through Game of Thrones is some of the most important psychological work you can do. It's the difference between being driven by unconscious forces and making conscious choices. It's the difference between projecting your disowned qualities onto others and taking responsibility for your own inner landscape. If this exploration resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own insights in the comments below. What Game of Thrones character do you find most compelling? And what might that reveal about your own shadow material? Hit that like button if this video helped you see these characters, and yourself, in a new light, and subscribe for more deep dives into psychology, philosophy, and personal development. Remember, the journey toward wholeness isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth it. Just like the characters of Game of Thrones, your story is still being written, and you have the power to integrate your shadow into a narrative of authentic growth and self-acceptance. Until next time, keep doing the inner work. Your future self will thank you for it.